I've had a lot of people ask me to do a video about LoveLace. If you haven't heard of LoveLace, it's what they're calling the new user interface for Home Assistant. This is in no way a comprehensive tutorial on LoveLace. It's really just not possible for me, or probably anybody else, to really cover everything you can do with LoveLace. The biggest reason for that is it's still really new, and they're still making a lot of changes every single day. But it's not too early to get started. So let's quit wasting time talking and start showing off some LoveLace. There are two ways to get started with LoveLace. The first is to use the new migration add-on. To get the add-on, go to your Has.io tab, the add-on store, and then under the community add-ons, which hopefully you already have installed, grab the one that says LoveLace Migration and hit install. It takes a couple minutes to install, but once it's here, hit start. I like to click the log refresh just to watch it do its work. When you see this line, that means it's done. Now you can go to your configuration folder and you'll find a new file called ui-lovelace.yaml. When you click on that lovelace.yaml file, you'll see that your existing user interface has been converted into a LoveLace compatible file. Thanks, Dale. This makes for a great starting point if you're happy with the way that your user interface already looks, and if you've already spent some time organizing it. Now for me, on the other hand, my user interface was a mess. So I decided to use the other method for starting to use LoveLace, which was just to create a ui-lovelace.yaml file that was empty and build it from scratch. So choose one method or the other, as long as you end up with a lovelace.yaml file. Now let's get into the fun stuff. Before we jump in and start looking at my LoveLace interface, I want to show you where you can get more information. Because like I said before, there's going to be a lot of things that I just am not going to be able to cover. First place to start is this LoveLace page on the homeassistant.io website. It'll tell you everything you need to know to get started and give you a lot of information about setting up views and about each different type of card. In addition to that, you'll probably want to bookmark this LoveLace Cards demo page. On this page, you can find an example of all the different types of cards, and if you click this Show Config button, it'll show you the entry for your YAML file to create the kind of card that you're looking at. Very handy. This is my new LoveLace user interface. First thing to tell you about LoveLace is that it's made up of views, cards, and entities. These tabs you see at the top are the views. These various boxes are cards, and each item in the card is an entity. This title here will show up at the top of my LoveLace UI, regardless of which view I'm looking at. Now we can make some views. Every view needs a title, but if you want to use an icon instead of a word for your view, then you define the icon right under the title. This can be any MDI icon. If you've never used MDI icons, here's a link where you can search through and pick the ones that you want. You just put the name of the icon here, and you're golden. You can also define a background or a theme for each view if you want. Once we've got a view, we need to start filling it with cards. This is a list of all the card types that are included with LoveLace by default. There are more than this, and some of the custom cards that you can add that aren't on this list are some of the coolest ones available. But this is part one. So we're going to start with the built-in card types. I've created an example that uses pretty much everything on this list. So let's walk through them one at a time. When you're defining a card, the first thing to do is define what type of card it's going to be. We're going to start with the first one on the list, which is just an entities card type. With the entities card type, the only thing that's required is that you include some entities. But if you want a title, you can add that. You can also add one button that'll turn on or turn off everything on the entity list. This office card is my example of an entities card. I did include the title, and I did include the toggle for every entity on the list. After that is my list of entities. These are just Home Assistant entity IDs. The entity card type is definitely the most basic and simple, and it's also the most like what we're used to seeing with the old Home Assistant user interface. It's comfy, like your old blankie. The next type of card is an entity filter. In this type of card, you include a list of entities and then a state filter so that you only show the entities that are in that state. Common use for this is who's home. So only the icons for people who are home will show up on this card. When somebody's not home, their icon goes away. So for my entity filter card, I've included the entity IDs for all of our device trackers, and my state filter is home. Now I'm going to combine my entity filter card and also make it a glance card. Making it a glance card will arrange the icons and the text in a more compact format. So instead of just a long list of icons, it'll stack them in rows and columns. A couple other options that you have for the glance card are to either include or exclude the state and the name of the entity. In this case, I took the entity names off because I know whose icon is whose. And I also took the state off because this is a card that only shows people who are home. I don't need it to say home under their icon. Now the card right below my who's home card is another entity filter card, but there are some differences. Just like the other card, I included a list of entities. One thing to tell you here is that in most cases, when you're listing entities, you can either just include the entity ID from Home Assistant, or you can define it as an entity object specific for LoveLace. In this case, that's what I did with this hall light. And I did it just so I can change the name. So if you want it as an entity object, instead of as just the entity ID, your entry will look like this. Entity, then the entity ID, and then underneath that, the specific details of that entity that apply only here in LoveLace. So for this one, I'm changing the name from Upstairs Hall, which was too long to fit on my card, to just Hall. And I also defined a tap action. A tap action dictates what happens when you click on that icon. So when I click on this Hall icon, the hall lights go off and the icon disappears from this card because this card is only showing entities that I put on this list that are in the state on. So when the hall light goes to off, it disappears. Computer, turn on Upstairs Hall light.
Okay.
And now it's back. Because I wanted to fit a lot of entities on this particular card, I also made it a glance. And as part of the options for a glance card, you can change the width of the column that each entity occupies. So to try and squish a few more in there, I set the width to 30%. One of the great things about LoveLace is that when you make changes, it doesn't require a restart of Home Assistant for you to see those changes. That is a huge and much welcome improvement. Thanks, guys. So if you want to see what happens when we change the width of the columns, let's make this 20%. Then save our LoveLace file and refresh our LoveLace page. So now you can fit more entities in one row, but depending on your text, you may chop some of it off. The next card I have on this view is just a media player. It's a really simple entry in your LoveLace YAML file, and then it looks and functions just like a media player card in the old Home Assistant UI. You can click on it to open it up, pause, play, and of course, text-to-speech. Next card to talk about is the history graph. This is useful if you want to see the state of a sensor over a period of time. To create it, you set the type of the card to history-graph. You define how many hours back in time you want the graph to show the history, and then how often in seconds you want that information to refresh. So I wanted to show a week's worth of data and have it refresh every hour. Finally, you need a list of the entities that you want the history graph to show. So for this example, I'm showing how much time my Xbox was logged in to Xbox Live compared to how many hours I worked in the past 7 days. For the entities in this card, I also defined one as an entity object, and then another one as just the entity ID from Home Assistant. And that was so I could change the name for that Xbox sensor, just to make it shorter. Now if I want to add another different type of sensor, I just add another entity like this, again save my LoveLace file, and then refresh my user interface. Now if I want, I could go back and see all the different places that Mrs. Z's has been over the past week. And of course, I have special zones set up for all the expensive shopping centers, so I can get an alarm when she goes there. The next card type in my YAML file is the weather forecast. In order to get this file, you need to have some sort of weather forecasting platform set up for you for Home Assistant. I've got Dark Sky set up, which is pretty common and very useful and very easy to set up. When you have Dark Sky set up, all you have to do is input these two lines to get this nice looking forecast card. Everybody loves a weather forecast. Another useful card is the map. When you define the card type as map and list as entities devices that you're tracking, those devices will show up on the map. And if you've defined specific zones in Home Assistant, you can also include those zones on the map. This one shows that Bearbait is actually hanging out with his friends at the mall. Remember, it's not stalking if it's your family. I know I went through those kind of fast. Those are just some of the basic card types, which pretty well match up with things that we were able to do in our old interface in Home Assistant. But some of the new and more exciting things that are specific to LoveLace are coming right up. For the most part, those are the ones that include images. Everybody likes to see those pretty pictures. I put some of my picture cards on a separate view. YAML files are very specific about their spacing. So when you're defining a new view, make sure that the title of that view lines up with the title of your other views. So here's my second view, which I called cameras. And instead of the word cameras, I wanted to see an icon of a camera. In LoveLace, there are two different kinds of stacks. There's a horizontal stack and there's a vertical stack. When you use either one, essentially what you're doing is creating a card and putting other cards inside of it. If you use horizontal stack, all the cards inside of it will be lined up next to each other, horizontally. The same goes for vertical. In a vertical stack, the cards will stay in the order that you put them in and stay stacked one above the other. So for these two picture cards, I put them in a horizontal stack. So they will always be next to each other. So you can see here what it looks like when you do a horizontal stack. The card type is horizontal stack. And then you have to list the cards that you want to stack inside that horizontal stack card. Does that make sense? So in this case, I've got two picture entity cards inside my horizontal stack card. Picture entities are cards that combine a picture with an entity. It's clever how they named that. When we want to start using pictures in our cards, there are a few different card types that use pictures. There's picture, picture entity, picture elements, and picture glance. The one here on the right is just a picture card. You can use a picture card to just show an image to take you to a different view in your LoveLace interface, or it can call a Home Assistant service. For this example, I have it set up to show an image that I'm storing locally. If you want to see a local image, you need to put that image in your www folder, which is a branch of your config folder. If you don't already have it, you can create it. But after you create it, you do have to restart Home Assistant for the items that you put in there to be recognized and available to Home Assistant. It's kind of cool to just have a picture that you can click on. And in this case, mine calls a service, but I can't see that anything happened. I don't know if the lights are on or off by looking at this image. The next type of picture card is a picture entity. That's what I've got here on the left. In this type of card, you have to define the entity that's associated with this card. For me, that's my office crown lights. Instead of pulling an image from a URL or locally, you can also use a camera. To do that, you just say camera image instead of just image. And in a picture entity, you can define the tap action, meaning what do you want to happen when you click the picture. So in this case, when I click the picture, my office lights go off. And when I click it again, they go on. Now, if you want your picture to respond with a different image when you click on it, then you need to make these changes. I took out the camera image, and then I defined the state image, one for on and one for off. So now when it's on, I get this image. And when I click it and turn it off, I get this image. Takes a little more work, but it's probably worth it. The next picture card type to talk about is the picture glance. That's what we got here. I also put this inside of a vertical stack so that this picture glance will always be above this, which is a special surprise I'm going to talk about in just a second. When you're setting up a picture glance, you need to start with an image. This is a local file of a picture I took in our backyard a few years ago that I love. For the entities that I'm including in my picture glance, I chose a bunch from my office. Some of them are just entity IDs from Home Assistant, but a couple of them I set up as entity objects. And I did that so that I could change the icons. But right now, in the version of LoveLace that I'm using, the option of defining a specific icon isn't active yet. The other thing you can do for now to change the icon of an entity is to go to the customization menu under your configuration. You select the entity that you want to change, and then you pick an attribute that you want to override. Choose icon, and then type in the MDI icon that you want. Save it, and it should update the icon. And here you can see it updated that icon for my garage lights in LoveLace. But you won't need to use this method for long. The ability to change the icon for specific entities will be a part of LoveLace very soon. But until then, you can do this. The next card type on my list, I'm very excited about. This is the iframe card type. This is what will allow you to show a website as part of your user interface. Now, one really important thing here is that if you're using SSL encryption, then you'll only be able to show websites that are HTTPS. And if you're not using SSL encryption, then you'll only be able to show websites that are HTTP. But for me, that's okay, because what I want to show is Volumio. This awesome iframe card lets me include and interact with my Volumio Pi. When you load a website in an iframe card, you can interact with it, just like if you were looking at it in a browser. So for me and Volumio, I can play, pause, change the volume, pick a new song, and anything else that I could do in a browser. This is awesome. If you don't know what Volumio is, it's a great way to turn a Raspberry Pi into a server for MP3s or internet radio stations. And you can use it for Spotify if you have a premium account. I love it. And I love that I can include it in my Home Assistant interface. That's fantastic. Thank you, iframe. I've been saving the best for last. For me, and probably for a lot of other Home Assistant users, the most exciting part about LoveLace is this picture elements card type. This is what lets you take an image, like a floor plan of your house or something you created in Sweet Home 3D, and then place entities that you can interact with anywhere you want on top of that image. Very similar to what we did with HA Floor Plan. This is the picture element card for the upstairs of my house. We're going to focus specifically on my office. I've included a bunch of different examples so we can go through a lot of the things you can do with the picture elements card. This is one of the things that I expect is going to change a lot as LoveLace continues to be developed. So some of what I may tell you now won't work later. Consider that fair warning. When you place entities on a picture element card, you do it by defining a percentage from the left and a percentage from the top. To help you out so that you don't have to do a bunch of guessing, there is a custom card type called plan coordinates. So before we get too far into the picture element card, let's set up the custom plan coordinates card. The first thing to do is go to this custom LoveLace GitHub page and then just download the whole thing as a zip file and save it somewhere you can find it. After you extract it, go into the plan coordinates folder and grab this plan coordinates.js file and put it in the www folder under your config folder for Home Assistant. After you've copied that file into that folder, go back to your LoveLace.yaml file and up at the very top, put these 3 lines: resources, the URL pointing to the file we just copied, and then type JS. Now we can start our first picture elements card. First, create a new view. I'm calling mine upstairs and I'm giving it an icon. And we want this view to be a panel. That means it'll take up the full width of the window and it will only display the top card. First, we make it a vertical stack. This is part of getting those plan coordinates to show up. Under our vertical stack, we define 2 more cards. The first one is a custom card for plan coordinates. It only takes 1 line to do that. The next card is our picture elements card. That's our floor plan. Inside of a picture elements card, you define a bunch of elements. Those are going to be your Home Assistant entities, and there are several different kinds of elements. I'm going to show you how to use some of them, but not all of them, and they may even add more in the future. The first kind of element to talk about is a state icon. That's pretty much what you expect from a Home Assistant user interface. It's an icon that represents an entity in Home Assistant. Interacting with a state icon happens when you define the tap action. Most commonly, that's going to be toggle, but you can also call other services, and we'll look at that in a minute. Now, since we have the plan coordinates custom card active, when I move my mouse around the picture, the top and left percentage change. So I put my mouse about where I want my element to show up, and then take note of the top percent and the left percent. And then in the YAML file, under the entity, I make a style entry and then put the top percent and the left percent. You've probably been patiently waiting for me to explain how you make the fan spin. The type of element that I used for the fan is an image. I define the entity as the switch on my office fan, and I set the tap action to toggle. Then the fun part here is that you can define the state image. So there's a different image for each state. And as one of those images, I can use a GIF file. So in this case, I just went to the interweb, found myself a GIF of a fan, and put it in my www folder. Now under the style heading for my fan image, in addition to defining the top percent and the left percent for location, I'm also defining the width. In LoveLace, that's how you define the size of your image. Icons come in at the defined size, but if you're putting in an image, it might be huge, or it might be really tiny. By changing the width percentage, you can adjust it so that it looks right on your plan. Another way to modify the image element is by using a state filter. You can see that my fan blades are a little blurry. That's because under the state filter, in the on state, I set a blur. And if I turn it off, it just shows the fan PNG file, and then it rotates the hue of the PNG file just a little bit so that I get the color that I want. If we want to play around with the colors a little bit, we can change this hue rotation. Now it's purple. If you're good with CSS, there's a lot of other ways that you can change and customize your elements. And again, as LoveLace continues to be developed, there's going to be more and more ways to customize things. For the next element type, we'll look at a state label. This is going to be a sensor value in letters or numbers, like for example, a temperature. So you define the entity as the sensor you want the value from, and then you define the style, first with location, and then with any other CSS attributes you want to define. If you want to change the color, you can do that. If you want to make it bold or italic, you can do that too. In this next example, I use an image element type again, but this time as a tap action. Instead of toggle, I'm going to do call service. When you do that, you have to define the service. In this case, it's going to be an input select option. Then you define the service data, which will include the entity ID, and in this case, which option I want it to select. Then I set 2 different state images, one for when it's on and one for when it's off. I set the location so my football uniform shows up where I want it, and then I set the width so that it's not super huge, taking up half my screen. And now when I click on it, I get a different state image, and you can't see it, but I've got my awesome Hail to the Victors lights all over my room. Go blue. For the last example, I'm going to use another image element, but this time for the state image, I'm going to use different images for each state and something more than just on or off. Start out by defining the entity, then defining the style, including location and a width to keep things from being too big or make them bigger if they're too small. Now I'm going to change the state of my device tracker. I'm just using the states page in Home Assistant. So when I set the state of my device tracker home, I get this. Awesome. When I set it to work, I get this, because that's why I go to work. And when I'm somewhere in between work and home, my state shows up as away, and it looks like this. Pretty cool. Each of those is just a PNG file located in my www folder. You can create your own, you can use emojis, emoticons, or just snag something from the internet. Well, that's it for now. I think that's pretty good for an intro to LoveLace. It's a lot to take in, but I think I gave you enough to get you started. If you want to know more, check out the Home Assistant LoveLace page. You can get more information about all the different card types, and especially a whole lot more that you can do with the Picture Elements card. And don't forget the LoveLace Card Demo Gallery. It's got an example for pretty much anything you want to use for the built-in card types. As it is, there's a lot you can do with LoveLace, and it's great. And we haven't even started talking about the custom cards yet. And there's also a really active Discord channel specifically for LoveLace. That's a lot of different places to go to get help. That should pretty well cover you for all the information you might need on how to make your own LoveLace interface. Well, that's it. LoveLace 101. The future of Home Assistant user interface. Now block out your calendar for the next few weeks. Dig in and make yourself an awesome interface. And then share it with the rest of us. That's all for now. As always, thanks for watching. Until next time, adios.